If there's one thing the mind fears most, it's the slow realization that something isn't quite right, that the world around you has shifted in ways you can't quite name. Tonight, we're exploring stories where reality bends in the quietest, most unsettling ways, the kind of dread that doesn't announce itself, the kind that whispers. I'm so glad you're here with me. Whether you've been listening for a while or you've just found your way to us, tonight feels like the right time to settle in with something that'll make you think twice about the familiar spaces around you. My name is Mr. Dantello, and tonight we're diving into the psychological and mind-bending. Those stories where the real horror lives in the space between what you see and what you know to be true. We have 3 stories for you tonight. First, we'll explore the hallway that gets longer when I stop looking at it. A meditation on the terror of noticing something impossible. Then we move to I keep finding my reflection blinking before I do, a quiet unraveling of the distance between you and your own image. And finally, we'll settle into the apartment where my furniture casts shadows from yesterday, where the past refuses to stay behind you. If you haven't already, please do leave a like and subscribe. It means everything, and it helps more people find their way here on nights like this. Now, get yourself comfortable. Dim the lights if you'd like. Find that position where you can really settle in and let your mind drift. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Now, let's begin with our first story. Story 1. The hallway that gets longer when I stop looking at it. Why does a hallway get longer when you're not looking at it? I still don't have an answer, and I've been living with this question for 3 weeks now. But I think I need to start by explaining what normal feels like, because that's the only way to understand how it stopped. I've lived in this apartment for 2 years. The hallway runs from my bedroom at one end to the kitchen at the other. A straightforward passage of maybe 20 feet, standard corridor in a building that's maybe 40 years old. Cream-colored walls that haven't been painted in a decade, a baseboard that's cracked in 3 places, and a single fluorescent fixture overhead that hums a low, almost subsonic note if you stand under it long enough. The kind of thing you stop hearing after a while. Or I had stopped hearing it. Now I hear it all the time. The doors are what make it feel lived in. There's my bedroom door on the left, painted a shade of gray-blue that I chose because it seemed neutral. My closet, a shallow, narrow thing just past that. On the right side, the bathroom door, then a small storage closet I've never quite filled. The hallway ends at the threshold to the kitchen, and the kitchen opens into the living room beyond. There are 7 floorboards between my bedroom door and the kitchen threshold if I take my normal stride. I've never counted them intentionally. I just know this the way you know how many steps it takes to get from your couch to your refrigerator. The hallway has always been ordinary. Aggressively, almost disappointingly ordinary. It was a Tuesday night, or maybe Wednesday morning. I've never been clear on which side of midnight the night actually breaks, when I first noticed something wasn't right. I had gone to bed around midnight and woken up thirsty. This happens often enough that I barely register it as an event. I drink water, I go back to sleep. My apartment is small. Nothing in it should take more than a minute to reach. I don't remember turning on the hallway light, which is unusual for me. I tend to do things in order when I'm half asleep, put on glasses, open the door, flip the switch. But this time, I was already in the hallway, and the light was on. The hum was immediate and present, pressing against my eardrums the way it does when you've just woken up and your senses are too raw. I was walking, not fast, just moving through space the way you do at 2 a.m. when everything feels fragile. My eyes weren't quite focused. That's important. I remember my vision being soft, the walls and door frames slightly blurred at the edges the way they get when you're tired. The light overhead was a smeared yellow streak. About halfway down, I think, though I'd learn later that halfway is a concept that doesn't quite apply anymore, I glanced at the bathroom door on my right. I don't know why. There was nothing unusual about it. The door was closed, as it always is, but my eyes caught on it for just a moment, and in that moment, I looked away from the direction I was traveling. It was the smallest thing. My gaze left the far end of the hallway, settled on the door, maybe registered the detail that the door's handle could use some polishing, and then I looked forward again. The far end, the kitchen threshold, was noticeably further away than it had been a second before. I stopped walking. The hum from the light seemed to get louder. I was standing perhaps 2/3 of the way down the hallway, and I could see the kitchen threshold perfectly clearly. The sharp angle where the hallway met the kitchen's open space. The faint glow of the microwave's clock showing in the darkness beyond. But it was definitely further, not by a huge amount, maybe 2 feet, maybe 3. It was hard to judge. I told myself I was still half asleep. Of course I was. Your perception of distance gets weird when you wake up disoriented. You misjudge. You stumble. Your brain takes a moment to recalibrate itself with the physical world. This was normal. This was fine. I walked the rest of the way to the kitchen, got my water from the tap, the same tap I'd turned on hundreds of times, and walked back to my bedroom. The hallway was normal on the return. It felt the right length. The distance was correct. I could feel it in my body the way you feel the right number of steps without counting them. I went back to sleep and didn't think about it for a full day. The next evening, the thought came back unbidden while I was cooking dinner. Was the hallway actually longer, or was I just tired? I couldn't stop myself from testing it. This is what I do. I worry at small inconsistencies the way your tongue finds a canker sore. I can't help it. So around 7 o'clock, when the light was starting to leave the apartment, but wasn't yet dark, I stood in my bedroom doorway and looked down the hallway. It looked exactly as I remembered it. 20 feet. 7 floorboards if you took my stride. Normal, familiar, the kind of space that recedes into itself because you've walked it so many times that it's become invisible. I started walking, keeping my eyes fixed on the far end. I focused on the kitchen threshold the way you focus on something you're trying to remember. Kitchen threshold. Kitchen threshold. Kitchen threshold. Don't look away. Don't break the line of sight. Just walk and watch and count the boards passing underneath you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I looked at the bathroom door. Just for a moment, just a flicker of attention. When I looked forward again, the kitchen threshold was visibly further away. I could feel it in my body before my brain even processed what my eyes were showing me. There was more hallway now, more space. The threshold, which had been approaching steadily, had suddenly receded by at least a few feet. I stopped walking immediately. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't frightened yet, not exactly. But there was a tight feeling in my chest, the sensation of something not making sense in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed. I could see the kitchen threshold clearly. The light from the living room was casting a pale glow on the kitchen's far wall. Everything was visible. Everything was there. But it was further away than it had been when I looked away for that one moment. I walked the rest of the way quickly, and when I was in the kitchen, I didn't turn around to look back. I didn't want to see what the hallway looked like from this angle. I poured myself a glass of water, drank it too quickly, and felt it sit uncomfortably in my stomach. That night, I didn't sleep well. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of light and fatigue. The setting sun coming through the living room windows at a certain angle could absolutely create the illusion of spatial distortion. And yesterday's sleep had been interrupted by thirst. I was running on a deficit. The mind sees what it expects to see, and when you're tired, your expectations get sloppy. Everything I'd read about human perception told me this was obvious. Simple, a non-event. But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew what I'd felt, that physical sense of distance changing mid-walk, the way your body understands space differently than your eyes do. I tested it again that night. This time, I did it deliberately. I stood in my bedroom doorway at 9 o'clock, when the hallway was lit by the overhead fluorescent and nothing else. I walked slowly, keeping my eyes on the far end, and after 4 steps, I let my gaze drift to the storage closet door on my right, a small, unremarkable door that I rarely open. The hallway stretched. I could measure it this time. The kitchen threshold went from being a certain distance away to being considerably further. Maybe 5 feet further. The difference was unmistakable. My eyes had been looking straight ahead, my perception of distance was reasonably calibrated, and then I looked away for the duration of an eye movement, and looked back, and the world had reconfigured itself. I stood very still for what felt like a long time. The hum of the light seemed louder than it should be. I could hear the ambient sound of the city outside my windows, a car passing, the distant murmur of voices from another apartment. The hallway smelled like it always did, faintly dusty, with an underlying note of the lemon-scented floor spray I used maybe once every 2 weeks. Everything was normal, except for the fact that the hallway was now longer than it had been 5 seconds ago. I walked to the kitchen. I didn't look anywhere but ahead. And when I reached the threshold, I stayed in the living room for another hour before I could make myself go back down the hallway to get to bed. When I did, I kept my eyes fixed forward and didn't look at anything else, and the hallway was the right length. 7 boards, 20 feet. Home, but my heart was moving wrong in my chest, and I knew I was going to test this again. I already knew that much about myself. The following night, I was more systematic. I stood at the bedroom end, and I planned my movements like an experiment. I would walk forward, fixing my eyes on the kitchen threshold. I would count the boards. At the halfway point, which should be at the bathroom door, I would deliberately look away, down at the floor, and then look back forward. I would measure the distance again. I could do this 3 times. I could gather data. The first test, the hallway stretched by what I estimated was 6 feet. The second test, by about 5 feet. The third test, by something closer to 8 feet. Each time, it was slightly different. Each time the change happened at the precise moment my eyes stopped looking directly at the far end and then resumed. There was no gradual warping. There was no slow distortion. There was only this: I look away. Something changes. I look back. The hallway is longer. By the third test, I was breathing too fast. I sat down on the hallway floor, which I'd never done before, and the linoleum was cold and slightly gritty under my palms, and I tried to think about what this meant. The logical possibilities, as I could construct them, were these: either the hallway was actually, physically changing size based on whether I was observing it, or my perception of spatial distance was fracturing in a way that felt absolutely real but had no basis in physical reality. I didn't know which option was worse. The hallway stayed normal when I wasn't testing it. I could walk from bedroom to kitchen without incident. The hallway was the same length it had always been. But the moment I introduced the variable, the moment I tested whether the distance changed when I looked away, something in the system shifted. Or something in me shifted. I got up off the floor. I didn't test it again that night. Instead, I went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the apartment. The refrigerator's low hum, the ambient noise of the building's pipes, the city beyond the walls, and underneath it all, the question that wouldn't quiet: why does it keep getting longer when I stop looking? It would take me several more nights to understand that this was a question I should stop asking, that the asking itself was part of what made it happen. But that understanding came later. Right now, in those early days, I was still trying to solve it the way you solve any puzzle that doesn't make sense. Through observation, through repetition, through looking and looking and looking, as if the act of witnessing could somehow make reality stabilize. I was wrong about that. The more I looked, the worse it became. The first real disruption came on a Wednesday morning. I remember the day clearly, not because it was Wednesday, but because I'd woken up feeling like I hadn't slept at all, even though I'd been unconscious for 8 hours. That peculiar exhaustion where rest doesn't actually rest you. I needed coffee. This was non-negotiable. The kitchen was at the far end of the hallway, and I walked it without thinking, the way you move through spaces you've inhabited for 2 years. My feet knew the distance. My body didn't need to measure. I was halfway there when I realized something was off. The hallway felt different. Not visually, I wasn't testing, I was just walking, but the air itself had changed. It was colder. Not dramatically so, but enough that I noticed. Enough to pull my attention to it, the way you become suddenly aware of a sound you've been ignoring. I stopped walking. That's when I felt it, the distinct sensation of the space behind me expanding. Not a sound, not a visual thing, a kind of pressure change in my awareness, like when you know someone's entered a room without turning around. The back of my neck prickled. I didn't turn around. I kept moving forward instead, faster, and reached the kitchen in what felt like too few steps. The coffee maker was on the counter where it always was. Sunlight cut through the window in its normal angle. Everything was ordinary. Everything was correct. But the hallway behind me felt stretched and wrong. I made the coffee with shaking hands. The water was too hot. It scalded my wrist as I poured, and I bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from crying out. The pain helped. It was real and immediate and had nothing to do with hallways. I didn't go back down that hallway until evening. By Friday, I'd convinced myself the Wednesday feeling had been nothing, a draft maybe, an early autumn cold snap, the building's old vac system doing something strange. I lived in an old place. Old places have quirks. This is what I told myself while I made breakfast. This is what I told myself while I showered. This is what I told myself while I sat at my desk pretending to work. My laptop open, but my eyes unfocused. It didn't work. The more rational explanations I built, the less stable they became. Explanations are structures, I realized. Frameworks, and frameworks need a foundation. Mine had none. That Friday evening I did something I hadn't done before. I looked up the hallway's length on my phone, used the laser measurement app, the kind contractors use. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, aimed at the far wall of the kitchen, and measured. 28 feet. I did it 3 more times, from different angles. Every measurement returned the same number, 28 feet. The hallway was 28 feet long. It had always been 28 feet long. I know this because I called the landlord once, years ago, asking about the floor plan. So why did it keep feeling longer? Why did it feel, when I wasn't looking, as if it extended into some impossible distance, some space the apartment couldn't actually contain? I put the phone away and sat on my bed for a long time. The real change happened on the 10th night. I'd been going to bed earlier, trying to avoid the hallway after dark. But on the 10th night, I needed water. My throat was dry, the kind of thirsty where your mouth feels lined with paper, and I had to get water from the kitchen. There was no way around it. I walked the hallway with my phone's flashlight on, the beam wavering slightly in front of me. 28 feet. I knew this. I measured it. It couldn't be anything else. The kitchen was dark. I didn't turn on the light. I just moved to the sink, ran cold water into a glass, drank it standing there with my eyes closed, letting the cool fill my throat. When I opened them, I looked back toward the hallway. The darkness looked different from this angle. The hallway's entrance seemed farther away than it should have been. Not drastically, not impossible, but wrong. The perspective was off, like looking at an optical illusion where two lines that should be parallel instead converge toward a vanishing point that's closer than it should be. I walked back down the hallway immediately. Fast, not running, I wouldn't let myself run, but with quick, measured steps. 12 steps. I counted. 12 steps to reach my bedroom. Normally, it took more. I didn't measure again. Saturday, I called in sick to work. I told them I had a migraine. This wasn't entirely false. My head had started hurting on Friday night and hadn't stopped. The pain existed behind my eyes, in the space between my thoughts. It was the physical manifestation of something that didn't have a name. I spent the day in my bedroom with the door closed. This is when I first noticed that the door made a difference. With my bedroom door open, I could feel the hallway, could sense its presence the way you sense a room full of people even when you're not looking at them. But with the door closed, the apartment felt smaller, contained, safe, so I kept the door closed. I ate cereal in bed for lunch. I didn't use the bathroom until the very last moment, and even then I moved quickly from the bedroom to the bathroom to the bedroom again, my eyes fixed forward, refusing to glance down the hallway's length. By evening, the migraine had evolved into something more complex. It wasn't just pain. It was a kind of pressure, as if my skull were slowly filling with something. Water, maybe, or air that couldn't find anywhere to go. I lay in the dark listening to the apartment breathe around me. That's what it sounded like, breathing, the pipes expanding and contracting, the building settling, the normal sounds of an old structure. But the timing of them had changed somehow. They were no longer random background noise. They were rhythmic, intentional. They moved in and out like lungs. In, out, in, out. I tried not to pay attention. Attention is fuel, I was beginning to understand. Attention is what makes things real. On Sunday, I looked directly at the hallway's far end for the first time in 4 days. I don't know why I did it. Compulsion, maybe. The same compulsion that makes you press on a bruise just to confirm it still hurt. The same impulse that makes you watch a video you know will disturb you over and over, searching for a detail that might explain what you're seeing. I stood in my bedroom doorway and I looked straight down the hallway toward the kitchen. Afternoon light came through the kitchen window, cutting the darkness in half. The hallway looked normal. It looked exactly 28 feet long. I felt the pressure in my chest release slightly, not completely, but enough that I could breathe properly for the first time in hours. Then I closed my eyes, just for a second, just to rest them. When I opened them again, the hallway was darker. Not because the light had changed. The light from the kitchen window was still at the same angle, but the hallway itself seemed to have absorbed the darkness, the way certain objects absorb color. The space between my bedroom and the kitchen had become a different kind of distance. It was longer. Not measurably longer, nothing the laser app would detect. But there, present, real, acknowledged, longer in the way that matters. I stepped backward into my bedroom and closed the door. I realized by Monday that my refrigerator had stopped humming. I couldn't remember when it had stopped. Sometime over the weekend, I suppose. But the silence it left behind was vast. It made the apartment feel even more still, even more like a place that was holding its breath. I opened my bedroom door just enough to listen. The hallway was quiet. The building was quiet. The city beyond the walls was muted somehow, as if sound were being absorbed by something. Then, faintly, I heard it, a scraping sound from the kitchen. Slow, rhythmic, the sound of something being dragged across linoleum. My first thought was that the refrigerator had shifted. Old appliances do that sometimes. They settle, they move slightly in their space, they scrape against the floor. My second thought was that I hadn't checked the kitchen in 3 days. My third thought was that I shouldn't check it now. I closed the door. The scraping continued for another 5 minutes. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with the door locked. I'd installed a lock months ago, before any of this started, because I liked privacy, and I listened to the apartment. The walls. The darkness. And underneath it all, something that might have been breathing, or might have been the hallway itself, expanding and contracting, learning to fill spaces where I wasn't watching. Tuesday morning I discovered I'd been awake for 36 hours without realizing it. There was no moment of transition, no sharp awareness that I'd crossed some threshold into genuine sleep deprivation. Instead, I noticed it the way you might notice a room has become cold, not when it happens, but when you become aware of it fully and realize it's been true for some time. I was sitting on my bed in the same clothes I'd worn since Sunday. My hands were shaking slightly. There was a taste in my mouth like pennies and dust. The most unsettling part wasn't the exhaustion. It was that I couldn't remember the hours between midnight and now. They existed. I knew they did. But they'd left no texture, no sense of duration. I'd simply been, and then it was dawn, and the quality of light through the window had changed. I stood and walked to the window. The street below looked normal, cars parked along the curb. A person in a dark coat walking past. Ordinary Tuesday morning in the building, in the city, in the world that still existed outside these 4 walls. When I turned from the window, I noticed my bedroom door was open. I never left it open when I locked it from the inside. I know this with absolute certainty because the lock has always been unreliable. I have to jiggle the mechanism while turning the handle. It's one of those small, annoying details that becomes second nature, a ritual you perform without thinking. Turn, jiggle, feel the tumbler catch. Every time. The door was open. My first instinct was to check if someone was in the apartment. But that thought came from television, from a version of fear that made sense in narrative. It came from the part of me that still wanted this to be explicable. The real fear, the honest fear, was that I had opened the door, that some part of my mind had been awake and moving while I existed in that blank space, that I'd been functioning without consciousness, that I had gotten up and approached the hallway while 36 hours unspooled around me like thread from a spool. I stepped into the hallway slowly. The air was different, cooler, not like air conditioning, like the cool that comes from underground places, from basements or caves, from spaces that don't see direct light. The light from the kitchen window was the same angle it had been yesterday, impossibly, which meant either no time had passed at all, or time had folded back on itself. The hallway was distinctly longer than it should be, not subtly longer, not in a way I could gaslight myself into ignoring. The distance from my bedroom door to the kitchen threshold was noticeably, undeniably extended. The hallway had expanded in the way that a balloon expands when you blow air into it, slowly, then all at once. Then it simply exists in its new size. The scraping sound came again, from the kitchen. This time I moved toward it. I can't explain why. Even now, trying to articulate this rationally, I can't construct a logical reason for my feet carrying me down that impossible hallway toward a sound I didn't want to investigate, except that I was no longer operating on logic. I was operating on the understanding, the bone-deep, inarguable knowledge that whatever was happening would continue whether I acknowledged it or not, that my attention was no longer fuel. My attention was now a lock, the only lock keeping it contained. The hallway felt longer as I walked it. Each step I took, the distance seemed to increase. It was like walking into an optical illusion that had become real, that had decided to implement itself in actual space. My bedroom door receded behind me. The kitchen doorway ahead of me didn't get closer. Then I understood. It was both. The hallway was expanding between me and both ends simultaneously. I kept walking. My breathing had become very audible. That sound of air moving in and out of my lungs, that's what the walls had been doing. I was sure of it now. The apartment itself was mimicking respiration, learning it from me. The kitchen appeared suddenly, as if distance had been negotiable all along and I'd finally found the right angle. The light from the window hit me like something physical. I raised my hand against it. The kitchen was empty. This shouldn't have been surprising, but it was. I'd been half convinced I would find something, some explanation, some presence, some figure standing at the far counter with its back turned, doing something to the contents of my cabinets. The emptiness was somehow worse. The refrigerator sat against the far wall, silent and dark. I approached it. The door was sealed, but when I got close, I could see my reflection in the stainless steel, and I didn't look right. Not monstrously wrong, that would have been simpler. But there was something off about the proportions. My shoulders seemed too far from my head. My eyes seemed to be looking slightly in different directions, or from different depths of the face, as if the surface of my reflection was no longer a flat plane. I reached out and touched it. The metal was warm, not body warm, not hot, but warm in the way a living thing is warm, the way flesh is warm. The surface had the slight give of skin, just microscopically, the way your own arm gives when you press it. I jerked my hand back. When I looked down at my palm, there was a mark. Not a burn or an injury. I have to be careful with words here, careful not to explain things that aren't explicable. It was a mark the way a thought is a mark on the mind. Temporary but real while it existed. Fading already. But there, that's when I heard it, the sound of breathing from the hallway. Not my breathing, not the apartment breathing, something else's breathing. It was coming closer. I spun around and looked at the kitchen entrance, at the mouth of the hallway I just walked through. The darkness at the hallway's threshold was perfectly black. A kind of black that light couldn't penetrate, that seemed to absorb the brightness from the kitchen and feed on it. Something was moving inside that black. I could hear it in the breathing, the disruption of air, the small rhythm of movement. It was coming toward me slowly, taking its time, as if it knew I was cornered, as if it understood perfectly well that I couldn't run deeper into the kitchen without a back door, couldn't climb out the window without a fire escape, couldn't do anything but stand and watch the hallway darken further. The breathing got closer. I backed away from it until I felt the refrigerator against my spine, the warm metal, the living cold, and I watched the hallway open its mouth. This is the part I can't make clear, no matter how many times I try to explain it. It wasn't an entity. It wasn't a figure. It wasn't something with a shape that I'm declining to describe to protect myself. It was a change in the hallway itself. The hallway deciding what it actually was. The hallway that had been expanding when I wasn't watching it, learning to breathe, teaching itself to want things. The hallway revealing what it had become. It moved toward me in a way that didn't require movement. It was simply closer than it had been. And then, closer than that, a process of arrival rather than approach. I closed my eyes. I don't know how long I stood there. My awareness broke into fragments. I was aware of the refrigerator behind me, humming now. When did it start humming again? Aware of the light from the window, aware of the breathing that was now indistinguishable from the white noise of my own body's systems. When I opened my eyes again, I was in my bedroom. The door was locked. I have no memory of running, no sense of how I crossed the hallway or what I did to get back here. My hands don't remember gripping the door frame or turning the lock. But I'm here. I'm breathing. The apartment around me is quiet. And in the gap beneath my bedroom door, I can see the hallway. It's still visible through that thin line of darkness. And I can see that it's getting longer. It's been getting longer the entire time I've been typing this. I haven't looked at it directly since I came back through the kitchen, but I can see it anyway, in my peripheral vision, in the space between the edge of the door and the frame. It's extending backward, deeper into the apartment, or maybe deeper into the hallway itself, finding new space, new geometry, new places to breathe. I think it's learning, and I think when it finishes learning, when it understands fully what it wants to be, it's going to open my door. Not with a handle or hinges, just by deciding that the door is no longer an obstacle. The way it decided the hallway was no longer a fixed distance. I'm going to stay in this room until I figure out what happens next. But I can already feel the pressure building, the walls of my small space contracting, the room getting smaller. Or maybe I'm the one getting larger. I've stopped paying attention to which is which. The police came on a Thursday afternoon. I remember because I'd been counting days by the light through my bedroom window, and Thursday has a particular quality. It's the day the neighbor downstairs waters her plants, and the sound of it carries through the floorboards like a rhythmic complaint. I'd unlocked the door at some point. I can't say precisely when. There's no memory of the decision. I only know that at a certain moment I was standing in the hallway again, and the hallway was perfectly ordinary, completely normal. The right length, the right width, the walls the color they'd always been, a shade of beige I'd never particularly liked, but had stopped noticing years ago. The apartment looked like it belonged to someone I used to know. I called the non-emergency line because I'd read something on my phone, or maybe I'd only thought I'd read it. The distinction has become unreliable that suggested I should appear cooperative. Sane, the woman who answered was polite and efficient. I told her I'd been disoriented, that I'd locked myself in my bedroom for a period I couldn't quantify, that nothing had actually happened, which made the whole thing harder to explain. She sent 2 officers. One was named Alex. The other one I didn't catch the name of. And I didn't ask for it a second time because asking seemed like something a person who wasn't fine would do. They walked through the apartment. They opened every door, turned on every light, ran their hands along the walls in the living room as if checking for something specific. They asked if I'd been experiencing any significant stress, any changes in sleep or appetite, any sense that reality was becoming difficult to trust. I said no to all of it. I was steady. I was clear. I was the kind of person who looks directly at you while they're lying. Alex asked about the hallway specifically. I remember that moment with an odd precision. He was standing at the mouth of it, the boundary between the living room and that passage. And he was looking at it the way you'd look at something you'd walked past 1,000 times without really seeing it. It's normal, I said, just a hallway. You called because of the hallway, he said, not accusing, just confirming. I called because I locked myself in the bedroom. The hallway wasn't the issue. He nodded. He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. They left after maybe 30 minutes. No report filed. No follow-up. Just 2 people satisfied that they'd responded to something and that nothing was actually wrong. After they left, I went to stand in that hallway for the first time in I don't know how long. It was exactly the right length, exactly the dimensions it should be. I could count the floorboards if I wanted to. I didn't, but I could. The walls were solid. The air smelled like dust and the faint chemical perfume of whatever cleaner the building's maintenance staff uses on the stairs. Everything was exactly as it should be. But I could feel it underneath that rightness. The thing that had learned my apartment, that had practiced walking through it while I wasn't watching. It was still here. It had simply decided that the best way to occupy a space was to make me doubt that it was ever here at all. I went back to work the following Monday. My boss didn't mention the days I'd missed. I'd sent emails in a voice that I didn't recognize as mine, professional, apologetic, the kind of tone that suggests a mild flu and nothing more. The emails had apparently been sufficient. I sat at my desk in the office I rarely think about while actually in it, and I did the work that I've been trained to do. The words came out. The emails were sent. Everything functioned exactly as it should. My coworkers made their usual jokes. The light from the window shifted across the desk at the usual angle. Nothing had changed. Except that I noticed around mid-afternoon on that Tuesday that the office hallway, the one that runs past my desk toward the bathrooms, felt slightly longer than it used to. Just a fraction. Just enough that when I counted the ceiling tiles out of an old habit I couldn't quite explain, I got a different number than I remembered. I didn't mention it to anyone. I went to the bathroom. I counted the tiles again. Got the same number as before. Got a different number. Got a number that shifted depending on whether I was looking at the hallway directly or using my peripheral vision to assess its depth. I came back to my desk and did my work. Nothing was wrong. Everything was fine. Reality is a thing we agree to maintain by not looking too closely at it. I've been home for 3 days now. It's a Friday. The apartment is quiet in a way that feels almost accusatory, as if it's waiting for me to pay attention to something specific. I haven't gone into the hallway since I got back. I don't need to. I can see it from my bedroom doorway. I can see the way it extends back toward the living room, the way the perspective lines converge and then diverge in ways that don't quite follow the rules of ordinary geometry. Additional middle section, the hallway at 3 a.m, is a different hallway than the one I walk during daylight. I've come to understand this not as metaphor, but as something closer to fact. The walls hold a quality of listening. They're cream-colored, the paint slightly yellowed near the baseboard where dust accumulates in a thin line like the watermark of some previous flood. I've studied that line for hours now. It's consistent. Orderly, things in my apartment are orderly when I'm looking at them. The light from my bedroom barely reaches past the threshold. What illuminates the hallway comes from the living room at the far end, that pale, indifferent glow of the television I left playing. I keep it on most nights now. The sound acts as a tether, a reminder that there are other rooms, that the hallway exists as a connector between spaces, not as its own separate place suspended in amber. but the texture of the air changes the moment I step into it. It's cooler here, despite the thermostat reading the same temperature everywhere. The coolness settles on my skin like a breath that isn't quite my own. My arms prickle. I can feel each hair responding to the shift, and I'm aware of my own body in a way I'm not in the bedroom or kitchen. I'm aware of being a thing contained in skin, a boundary, something with edges. The carpet beneath my feet is the same neutral gray it's always been, but at night it feels different under my soles, denser somehow, less forgiving. Each step produces a whisper of friction, so quiet I have to strain to hear it, which means I'm always straining. My attention is always caught there, at the point of contact between my foot and the floor. It's exhausting. The deliberate act of walking becomes a performance I'm watching myself execute. The walls, when I look at them directly, show me nothing remarkable. But peripheral vision is where uncertainty lives. In the corner of my eye, the shadows along the wall seem to shift, not move. I'm careful about that distinction now. They don't move, but they're not quite where I remember them being, and that gap between memory and current perception is where the dread settles. It's the gap where things become untrue. I've started noticing the sounds the hallway makes when it thinks I'm not listening carefully, a soft creak from somewhere in the plaster. The building settling, the rational part of me insists. Older buildings make noise. But the creak comes from no specific location. It seems to emanate from the walls themselves, from the space between the painted surface and whatever lies behind it. I imagine the cavity there, the dark, sealed void between the interior walls where moisture collects and dust gathers and small creatures might make their incomprehensible journeys. There's a light switch halfway down the hallway. It's a standard switch plate, beige plastic, the kind that came with the apartment. I stopped using it weeks ago. Not because the overhead light doesn't work. It does, humming to life with a brief electronic resistance before the fluorescent fixture stutters into brightness. I stopped using it because I realized I didn't know what I preferred, the uncertain darkness or the harsh, shadowless illumination that makes the hallway feel like a photograph of itself rather than a real space. The darkness at least feels honest. It hides nothing because it conceals everything equally. But the light creates a space that looks identical to how it looks in daylight, and yet it's fundamentally wrong. The proportions seem off under that fluorescent glare. The hallway feels narrower and longer simultaneously, the ceiling lower, the air more compressed. It's as though the light is showing me a version of the hallway that exists only when I'm not paying proper attention to it. So I move through the dimness now, using the television glow as my only guide. It's safer somehow. The darkness has rules I understand, limitations that make sense. My breathing changes the moment I enter the hallway. I become aware of the mechanics of it, the intake of air through my nostrils, the slight whistling sound that happens when I exhale. My lungs feel smaller. The oxygen seems less effective, as though the air here has been breathed before, depleted of something essential. I find myself taking deeper breaths deliberately to compensate. But that makes me think more about breathing, which makes it harder, which creates a kind of spiral that I have to consciously interrupt. I count my steps. I've been doing this without meaning to, but eventually I became conscious of it. One foot in front of the other. Counting, the numbers have become a rhythm, almost a meditation. It gives my mind something to hold on to besides the growing conviction that I'm walking through a space that doesn't want to be walked through. The walls have a faint smell, not unpleasant, just present. It's the smell of paint and drywall and the specific scent of dust that's been accumulating for a while. But underneath that, there's something else. Something that might be mold or might be the building's age or might be nothing at all. Just my brain inventing scent from absence. I've read about that. How the mind can create sensory experiences when it's under stress. How expectation can become sensation. But knowing this doesn't change anything. The smell persists. The hallway persists. And I persist in moving through it, caught in the strange compromise between the bedroom I need to return to and the living room I'm trying to reach. Suspended in the long gray space between one kind of safety and another. The passage has become a thing I navigate rather than a thing I simply walk through. It's breathing again. Slow, patient, learning last night I measured it with a piece of string. This morning I measured it again. It was longer. Not dramatically, just by an inch. Maybe less. Maybe the string itself had shifted, or maybe the apartment had found a way to expand without actually moving anything. I've stopped wondering which explanation makes more sense. I've stopped wondering about a lot of things. Instead, I sit on the edge of my bed and I watch the hallway through the gap beneath my door. I watch the way the darkness pulls at its far end. I watch the way the shadows move, not cast by anything I can identify, but present nonetheless. Shifting, rearranging themselves into configurations that almost spell something. Almost the strange thing is this: I'm waiting for it. I know what that means about me. I know what it suggests. But somewhere in the days of locked doors and dilating hallways, something in my understanding of what I should fear has rearranged itself. The thing in the apartment, the thing that learned to breathe, it's not a threat, not exactly. It's more like a presence that shares the space with me. A version of the apartment that's becoming aware of itself and, in becoming aware, becoming something else entirely. It wants to show me something. It's been trying to show me for a long time. It's just taken me this long to stop running, to understand that the hallway isn't getting longer because it's trying to trap me. It's getting longer because it's trying to fit something inside itself. Something that doesn't have a fixed size. Something that was already here, already moving through the spaces between walls and floors. Something that I'm only now beginning to notice was inside me too. And last night, I did something I haven't done since that first night. I stood at the threshold of the hallway and looked into it directly. Not with fear, not with confusion, just looking. It was still there. That change in the space, that awareness, that breathing rhythm that might have been the hallway, or might have been me, or might have been something without the distinction to make a difference. And when I looked at it, when I really paid attention, it stopped getting longer. For the first time since the police left, the hallway was exactly the right size. It still is. But I can feel it practicing again when I'm not watching, teaching itself to expand, learning new dimensions, preparing for something. And tomorrow, I suspect, I'll measure it with string again, and it will be longer, and I'll be waiting for that. I'll be ready. The apartment and I have made some kind of agreement, though I can't remember making it. We share this space now. We're learning each other's geometry, learning what it means to occupy the same space while being fundamentally incompatible with each other's structure. The hallway is longer tonight than it was this morning. But I've stopped looking directly at it. I've learned that lesson too. Story 2. I keep finding my reflection blinking before I do. The thing that started it all was something I couldn't quite name. Not yet. Not until I'd stood in front of that mirror enough times to know I wasn't imagining it. I've always been precise about details. It's the only thing that's ever made sense to me, noticing what's actually there, what's actually happening, rather than what I think should be happening. Most people move through their lives half asleep, on autopilot. I've never been able to do that. Even at 2 a.m, when everyone else is unconscious, I'm awake. Cataloging Aware that night started like most nights lately. Insomnia has its own rhythm if you stop fighting it. Around midnight, I'd given up on sleep and moved to the couch with my phone, scrolling through nothing in particular until my eyes burned. By 2, the apartment had that particular quiet that only comes in the deep hours, the kind where you can hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing on the street below, the white noise of a city that never actually sleeps but pretends to. My mouth felt thick. I went to brush my teeth. The bathroom was exactly as I'd left it that morning. Small, white tiles. The fluorescent bulb above the mirror hummed its constant, slightly irritating frequency. I'd been meaning to replace it for weeks. It had that quality where it was just barely too bright, making everything look both overexposed and somehow wrong, like you were seeing the world through an old camera filter. The sink was clean. The mirror predictably reflected my face back at me in that unflattering, too honest way bathroom mirrors do at 2 a.m. I was tired. There's no way around that fact. My eyes were bordered in gray shadow. My jaw was shadowed with stubble. I looked, in the most basic sense, like someone who hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. I turned on the water, let it run until it was warm, and started brushing. My reflection brushed back at me. Of course it did. That's what reflections do. I watched myself go through the familiar motion, the angled strokes, the careful attention to the gum line. The little ritual I'd performed the same way since I was 6 years old. Small window to my left, above the radiator. The city lights came through it in a vague glow, the ambient light pollution that never lets darkness be truly dark anymore. I was mid-stroke when I noticed it. My reflection blinked a fraction of a second before I did. Not much, not noticeably, but I felt it. That tiny, impossible lag between the moment my eyelids should have closed and the moment they actually did. Like the image in the mirror was operating on a very slight delay from my body. Like I was watching a video call with poor connection. That millisecond of temporal dislocation that you normally never notice because you're not really paying attention. But I was paying attention. I stopped mid-brush, kept my eyes open, waited. My reflection waited too. Then I blinked deliberately, slowly, intentionally, watching myself do it in the glass. And there it was again. The reflection blinked first. My eyelids followed half a beat later, like they were responding to what I was seeing rather than initiating what the mirror was reflecting. The toothbrush hung in my hand, forgotten. The water was still running. The fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, indifferent to the small inconsistency I'd just catalogued. I must have been more exhausted than I thought. That was the obvious explanation. Sleep deprivation does things to perception. The brain misfires. You become hyper-aware of tiny details and then you misinterpret them. You see connections that aren't there. Your timing gets scrambled. It's a well-documented phenomenon. I finished brushing my teeth. Rinsed. The water was warm on my hands. Everything felt normal. The mirror showed me what mirrors show, myself, tired and ordinary, going through the ordinary mechanics of nighttime hygiene. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, that I'd glimpsed a moment where the world's machinery became visible, a split second where the reflection wasn't quite following the rules I'd trusted since childhood. I turned off the light and went back to the couch. The television murmured in the dark. I lay there, listening to the city beyond the walls, feeling the peculiar awareness that comes with profound sleeplessness, that strange, almost euphoric clarity mixed with the sensation that your brain is slowly coming loose from its moorings. My apartment is small. I've lived alone here for 5 years. I know every surface, every angle, every way the light falls through each window at different times of day. I know the sound of the pipes in the walls. I know which floorboards creak and why. This is my space, my controlled environment, the place where I'm most certain of what's real. Except now I wasn't certain. I thought about my reflection blanket before I blinked. I thought about the impossible sequence of events. I thought about how, if you really pay attention to anything at all, you eventually start finding things that don't fit, details that break the pattern, moments where reality seems to glitch. The question isn't whether those moments are real. The question is whether you should have noticed them at all. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark listening to the buildings settle around me, feeling the weight of my own impossible memory. By the time the gray light of dawn started pressing through the windows, I'd almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. A trick of exhaustion, a misread of my own perception, the kind of thing that dissolves in the morning and never comes back. But that's the thing about being detail-oriented, about being someone who notices what actually is rather than what should be. I was already planning to go back to that bathroom mirror tonight. I was already planning to watch. The bathroom mirror didn't reveal anything unusual that first night I returned to it. I'd prepared myself with coffee and a kind of grim determination. Sitting on the edge of the bathtub with the lights dimmed to that exact same level as before. I watched my face in the glass for nearly 40 minutes, blinked deliberately, blinked without warning, looked away, and then looked back suddenly, trying to catch some asymmetry, some lag in the reflection's response. There was nothing. Just me, tired and unshaven, staring back with perfect synchronization. The mirror did what mirrors do. By 2 a.m., I felt ridiculous. Paranoid, the kind of person who becomes obsessed with a fluke and builds an entire mythology around it. I went to bed almost relieved, almost convinced that the previous night had been exactly what it appeared to be in daylight, a glitch in perception. Nothing more. The next day was Thursday. Ordinary, I worked from my apartment, taking calls, responding to emails, eating lunch at my desk. The kind of day that passes without leaving any impression. I remember thinking how strange it was that something as mundane as this could happen in the same space where I'd felt that terrible, vertiginous wrongness just 2 days before. Daylight erased it all, turned it into the kind of story you tell yourself when you're tired and alone. It was Thursday evening when I noticed the first real thing. I was standing in the kitchen, making dinner. Just pasta, nothing complicated. I had my phone propped against a water glass, watching something to distract myself. The apartment was quiet in that way it always is when the building is fully occupied. That settled hum of other people living their lives behind walls. Footsteps overhead. The distant sound of someone's television. The ambient proof that I wasn't alone in the world, even if I was alone in my space. I reached up to adjust the kitchen light, the one on the ceiling, and I noticed that the shadows under the counter were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not in a way that made sense to articulate, but wrong in the way you notice when something is slightly off register, like a photograph that's been shifted just a fraction of an inch on a wall. The shadow cast by the edge of the counter should have angled down toward the floor in a specific way, following the geometry of the light source above. But it didn't. It was slightly too sharp, slightly too defined, as if the light and shadow had agreed on a slightly different contract than the laws of physics should have allowed. I stared at it. I moved my head. The shadow adjusted, became normal again, slipped back into the predictable play of light and obstruction. My brain wanted to settle. The coffee I'd been drinking wanted me to settle. Everything in me wanted to move on and eat my pasta and forget about it. But I didn't move. I watched that shadow for 5 more minutes. I turned the light on brighter, then dimmer. I moved the counter's contents around, creating different obstructions, and every few seconds, when I wasn't directly looking at the shadow, when my eyes were just slightly out of focus, it would be wrong again, that fractional misalignment, that sense of something not quite adhering to the rules. Then I'd look directly at it, and it would correct itself instantly, as though it had been caught doing something it shouldn't and had quickly resumed its proper behavior. I realized my hands were shaking slightly. I didn't finish the pasta. Over the next few days, I started noticing other small things. Nothing that would matter to anyone else. Nothing that would hold up if I tried to explain it. But things nonetheless. The corner of my bedroom wall, where two planes met at the ceiling, sometimes appeared to be at a fractionally different angle than it should be. Not noticeably wrong if you looked directly at it, but off, subtly misaligned, when you caught it in peripheral vision. The angle would shift, settle back into geometry, become normal again. I measured it with my phone once using the Level app. Everything registered as it should. The walls were plumb, the geometry was perfect. And yet, the hallway outside my apartment seemed, on some days, to extend slightly farther than on others. I know the distance from my door to the elevator precisely. It's something I'd paced out unconsciously 1,000 times. 34 steps, give or take a step depending on stride length. But on Tuesday I counted 36. On Thursday I counted 32. The hallway wasn't changing. I was measuring correctly. The distance wasn't varying, but my perception of it was stretching and contracting, and I couldn't determine which version was actually real. I started keeping a small notebook in my pocket. Nothing elaborate, just time, location, what I observed. A log of the small wrongnesses. A way to ground myself in observable fact rather than suspicion. Friday night, it was my hands. I was at my desk working, and I noticed that my left hand looked slightly different than my right. Not obviously different. Everything was symmetrical as it should be. The proportions were correct. 5 fingers, proper joints, familiar scars and calluses in the right places. But something about the perspective was off. It was as if I was looking at my left hand from a slightly different angle than my right, even though both were in the same plane, both equally visible in the same light. The angle of vision didn't match. My left hand was giving off a perspective that my left eye shouldn't have been seeing. I lifted it closer to my face. The wrongness vanished immediately. Both hands looked completely normal, completely identical, perfectly symmetrical and properly angled. I put my hand back down without looking at it directly, using only peripheral awareness, and the wrongness returned. It was like being offered evidence of something by your own body, evidence that contradicted itself the moment you tried to examine it. Sunday morning, I looked in the mirror to shave. For a moment, genuinely only a moment, I couldn't quite place my features. Everything was in the correct order. Eyes, nose, mouth, proportions, symmetry, but there was a sense that they'd been rearranged on my face just slightly, as though someone had adjusted them by fractions of millimeters and then restored them before I could fully process the change. The expression wasn't quite my expression. The look wasn't quite my look. Then it settled. I blinked, and my face was normal again, exactly as it should be, exactly as it had always been. I didn't shave that day. By Sunday evening, I was starting to feel the weight of it all in a way I couldn't ignore. The small wrongnesses were accumulating, not proving anything definitive, but forming a pattern of their own, a pattern of things that didn't quite fit, moments where perception and reality seemed to be negotiating with each other in the space of my own apartment. I considered calling someone, a friend maybe, but what would I say? That shadows were wrong sometimes? That my hands looked off in peripheral vision? That my hallway seemed variable? These were the kinds of things that sounded insane when spoken aloud. They sounded like the prelude to something worse, the kind of complaint that would get you referred to someone professional, someone who would want to medicate you or diagnose you, or at minimum, convince you that you were experiencing something clinical rather than something that was actually happening. So, I didn't call anyone. Instead, I set up my phone on a small tripod in the bathroom, pointed it at the mirror, started recording. If I was going to catch something actually wrong, I'd need evidence. Not observations, not interpretations. Video, proof that something was occurring in my space that violated basic reality, and that I wasn't simply a person whose mind was slowly fragmenting under the pressure of my own awareness. I pressed record and stood in front of the mirror for exactly 30 minutes. Just watching, just being present. The footage would either show nothing unusual, in which case I'd have some relief, some confirmation that I was imagining this, or it would show something. And if it showed something, then at least I'd know that the wrongness wasn't internal, that it was actually there. When the timer hit 30 minutes, I stopped recording. I didn't watch the footage immediately. I sat in my kitchen with the phone in front of me, understanding that I was at a kind of threshold. Watching the video would either confirm my sanity or shatter it. I wasn't sure which outcome I was hoping for. It was nearly midnight when I finally pressed play. The recording started normally, me standing in the bathroom, the mirror behind me, reflecting the space. I watched for perhaps 2 minutes, bored, normal footage, and then I saw it. In the mirror's reflection, for a single frame that my mind almost dismissed, my arm bent at an angle that wasn't anatomically possible. Not grotesquely wrong, just bent at a slightly sharper angle at the elbow than human joints should allow. Settle. The kind of thing you'd miss if you blinked. I rewound and watched it again, frame by frame, moving through the playback in slow motion. It was there, clearly there, unmistakably wrong. And then, in the next frame, my arm was back to normal, bent at the proper angle, positioned correctly, as though nothing had happened. I watched the rest of the footage. Everything else was completely mundane. Me standing still. Breathing, the reflection doing exactly what it should do, except for that one frame. That single impossible frame where my body had agreed to a different set of rules. I saved the video to multiple locations. Encrypted it. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I was afraid the file itself would become corrupted. Maybe because I understood, in some instinctive way, that I had captured something that shouldn't exist. And I needed to protect that evidence like it was a piece of something dangerous. It was Monday morning when I realized something else. Something I should have noticed already, but hadn't. I wasn't sure what day it actually was anymore. I'd been writing the dates in my notebook, marking each observation. But when I looked back through the pages, the days didn't match up with the calendar on my phone. Or rather, they did technically match. Monday was Monday, Tuesday was Tuesday, but the sequence felt wrong somehow. I could remember things happening, remember observations I'd made, but I couldn't quite thread them together into a coherent timeline. Had the shadow incident been Thursday or Wednesday? Had the hallway thing been on Tuesday? Or had it actually been Friday? I had written the dates down, but the handwriting looked unfamiliar. Not wrong, exactly, just not quite like the way I usually write. I put the notebook down. For the first time since this had started, I considered the possibility that the problem wasn't external, that nothing strange was actually happening in my apartment, that the wrongness was entirely contained within me. I stopped leaving my apartment. Not consciously at first. It was just that every reason to go outside seemed thin and easily dismissed. The grocery store could wait another day. I didn't need to check the mail. My job had always been flexible, and when my manager called asking about the reports I hadn't submitted, I found myself unable to explain what I'd been doing instead. The past week, or was it 2 weeks, had simply dissolved into a fog of observation. It was easier to stay inside. Inside, I could control what I saw. Or at least, I could pretend to. The notebook had become something different than a record. It was proof. Tethered to a version of myself that could still distinguish between what was real and what wasn't. I filled page after page with descriptions, timestamps, sketches of the hallway at different moments. The handwriting continued to drift, becoming more angular, less like my own. But I kept writing anyway. If I stopped documenting, then the experience would exist only in memory, and memory had already proven itself to be unreliable. The notebook was external, physical, real on what I thought was a Wednesday. Though I'd stopped trusting the calendar entirely, I noticed something in my kitchen. A glass of water sat on the counter beside the sink. I hadn't poured it. I was certain of that, with an absolute certainty that had become rarer in recent days. I always left my water bottles in the bedroom. I didn't use glasses, too easy to forget about and leave out, and I'd always been careful about these things, meticulous in a way that bordered on compulsive. The water was room temperature. slightly cloudy as though it had been sitting for hours. I stood in the doorway and stared at it for a long time. Then I poured it down the drain. An hour later, there was a glass on the counter again. This time I didn't pour it out. I moved it instead to the far side of the kitchen, placing it in a cabinet I rarely opened. If I didn't see it, I reasoned, then it was easier to process. To file away as my own mistake, something I'd done in a moment of absent-mindedness and forgotten. By evening, there were 3 glasses on the counter. I stood in the kitchen and counted them, my hands beginning to shake. The logical part of my mind, the part that still believed in logic, offered explanations. I was doing this. I had done this, forgotten I'd done it, and done it again. My apartment was small. My routines were compressed and overlapping. It was entirely possible that I'd fallen into some pattern of behavior so automatic that I no longer recognized my own actions. Except I could feel the difference between what I did and what was happening to me. There was a quality to my choices, to the times I actually acted, that carried intention, a kind of muscular awareness. When I walked across the room, I knew it. When I reached for something, I felt the decision move through my body first. These glasses weren't like that. They were simply there, and I had to construct the memory of creating them backward from the fact of their existence. I left them on the counter. By the next morning, there were 11 glasses. By the following night, the counter was lined with them, water cloudy in each one, positioned with careful spacing as though arranged by someone who cared very much about symmetry. I called Alex, who was my closest friend, though it had been weeks since we'd spoken. The number rang and rang. When someone finally picked up, their voice was confused, asking who this was. I'd called the wrong person. I'd somehow called a stranger, which meant either I'd always had this person in my phone under Alex's name, or something had altered the contact. I hung up without explaining. My fingers felt wrong when I tried to text. The keys responded too quickly, or else too slowly. I couldn't quite synchronize with them. Half of my messages were filled with typos that looked almost intentional, words sliding into other words, letters in the wrong order. When I tried to reread what I'd written, the text seemed to rearrange itself, meanings shifting slightly with each reading until I wasn't sure what I'd originally meant to say. I stopped trying to contact anyone. The hallway had changed. I was certain of this now. The doors were still there. My apartment, the neighbors across the way, the emergency exit. But the distance between them had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like the hallway had stretched into something impossible. But the proportion of space felt wrong, as though I was looking at it through a lens that had warped the perspective slightly. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper. The light from the windows at the far end didn't quite reach as far as it should have. I spent a night measuring it with a tape measure I found in a drawer I didn't remember owning. The numbers came out right. Approximately 30 feet from my door to the emergency exit. Reasonable, normal, everything checked out perfectly. But when I walked it, It took longer. My pace was steady, my strides even, but the distance became elastic. Some nights it felt like 40 feet. Other nights, 50. I stopped measuring after that. The mirror in my bathroom had become something I avoided. I could feel it watching me, which was absurd. A mirror couldn't watch anything. A mirror was passive, reflective, simple. But when I caught my peripheral vision of it, there was a quality to my reflection that felt anticipatory, as though it was waiting for me to look at it directly, waiting for some moment when I wasn't paying close enough attention to catch whatever it was planning to do. So I developed a system. I kept my eyes on the floor when I entered the bathroom. I used the sink with my gaze fixed downward. When I had to see my face, I used the small mirror on my phone camera, which showed only a narrow rectangle of my features. It was easier that way. But last night, something had happened that I couldn't adequately explain even to myself. I'd been sitting in bed, unable to sleep, when I noticed a movement in the darkened reflection of the bedroom window. My reflection, sitting on the bed beside me, had moved a half-second before I did. No, not a half-second. It had moved first. And then I had mirrored its movement. The sequence had been backward. I'd watched it happen twice more before I'd gotten out of bed and stood in the center of the room with all the lights on, heart hammering in my chest, understanding with a growing crystalline certainty that something fundamental had gone wrong. Not with my perception, not with my mind, with me, with the basic order of myself. I'd look down at my hands, turning them over, half expecting them to be wrong again, bent at angles that shouldn't be possible, shaped differently than I remembered. But they looked normal. They looked like my hands. Except when I flexed my fingers, there was a kind of lag to the sensation, not pain. Just a delay between the intention to move and the moment the movement actually registered in my proprioceptive awareness. My body was becoming a room I was living in, and the door was slowly closing. This morning, if it was morning, the light from my windows had been gray and ambiguous for days now. I'd found myself standing in front of the mirror without having decided to go there. I don't remember walking to the bathroom. I don't remember my hand reaching for the light switch. But I was there, and my reflection was waiting for me with an expression I didn't remember making. It looked tired, but not the normal kind of tired. It looked hollowed out, the way a person looks after they've been worn down by something diminished. My reflection's eyes seemed darker, set deeper into my face, and when I smiled at it, a small, tentative gesture meant to anchor myself in something I could control. My reflection smiled back a fraction of a second too late. But it was still smiling now, even though I'd stopped. I'd backed away from the mirror slowly, keeping my eyes on it. My reflection had remained at the glass, grinning that small, exhausted grin, not moving, not blinking, just waiting. I'm writing this now, sitting in my kitchen with the notebook in front of me. The glasses of water are still here. There are more of them now. They cover half the counter, and I don't remember putting out any of them. My handwriting has become almost unrecognizable, looping and strange, like someone learning to write by copying the shapes without understanding the language. I think something has been using my hands. I think something has been standing up when I sat down, walking when I was still, moving through my apartment when I thought I was alone. I think my reflection has finally learned how to lead instead of follow, and I've been standing in the wrong position for days, watching myself from the outside while something else wore my shape. The worst part isn't knowing this. The worst part is that I can't quite bring myself to be horrified. There's a kind of relief in it. If it's not me, then I'm not going insane. If something else is driving, then the erratic days, the lost time, the notebooks filled with handwriting I don't recognize, these are things that happened to me, not things I did to myself. My reflection is still in the bathroom. I can feel it, waiting, and I think tomorrow or the day after, when I finally can't help but look at the mirror again, I'm going to understand that it's been waiting for me to stop fighting, to finally just sit still and let it finish whatever it started. That's when I'll remember that there are two of us in this apartment now. I'm just not sure anymore which one is me. I don't know how long I sat in that kitchen. The gray light from the windows shifted incrementally, or perhaps it didn't shift at all. There's no reliable way to measure time when you've stopped trusting the evidence of your senses. At some point, my hands stopped shaking. At some point, I became aware that I was very thirsty, and I picked up one of the glasses from the counter. The water was room temperature and tasted faintly metallic, like it had been sitting there for longer than I could calculate. I drank it anyway. After that, something changed. Not dramatically, not in any way I could point to and say, there, that's when it happened. The change was the kind that accumulates in the spaces between moments, the way dusk turns into dark without any single moment where the light switches off. I became aware, gradually, that I was still myself again, or that the distinction between myself and whatever else had been occupying this body had simply become too blurred to measure. The apartment looked the same. The glasses of water were still there, though I couldn't bring myself to remove them at first. I'd stand in the kitchen and look at them, at the faint dust already settling on the rims, and I'd think about how long they'd been sitting there. Days, weeks, maybe. Time doesn't move the same way when you're not entirely present to count it. My reflection, when I finally forced myself to look at it again, had been exhausted. That was the first thing I noticed. Not threatening anymore, just tired. It sat in the mirror the way I imagine I sit now, after days of existing in this state, and I felt something like recognition pass between us. We'd both been wearing the same face for too long. We'd both been learning to move through the same rooms, and the effort had worn us both thin. I don't actually remember the moment I accepted it. There was no decision point, no threshold I deliberately crossed. But somewhere between then and now, the horror of it had transformed into something quieter, something closer to coexistence. The thing in the mirror, or the part of me that lived in the mirror, had stopped trying to convince me it wasn't me. And I had stopped trying to convince myself it wasn't there. We developed a kind of routine. In the mornings, I would move through my apartment with a careful awareness of how my body inhabited the space. There's a particular quality to that awareness now, a slight offset between the intention and the execution, a microsecond where the movement happens just outside my direct perception. I've learned to move with it rather than against it. It's smoother that way, less exhausting. The cups I don't drink from, I leave in the sink. The water I drink tastes like it always has, now that I've stopped examining it. My reflection blinks when I blink, most of the time, though occasionally, once every few days, there's still that small, terrible lag. When it happens, I've learned to simply turn away, acknowledge it, and move on. Getting upset about it only makes the day longer. I returned to work. That was unexpected. I didn't remember calling my manager, but apparently I had. And apparently I'd explained my absence in a way that satisfied them. My colleagues looked at me carefully when I returned, the kind of careful-looking people do when they've convinced themselves they notice something wrong about you but can't quite pinpoint what. I let them look. I smiled when required. My reflection in the office bathroom mirror was learning to make the right expressions at the right times. We were getting better at it. The apartment still feels larger than it should. The hallway from the bedroom to the kitchen seems to take longer than the square footage suggests. My brain, when I try to map the rooms against each other, encounters spaces that don't quite add up. The window in my bedroom faces east, or it should. I remember leasing the place partly because of the morning light. But lately, the light comes in from angles that don't make geometric sense. The walls might have moved, or the apartment might have always been larger than I perceived, and I'm only now understanding its actual shape. I don't investigate these discrepancies. That way lies the kind of detailed observation that leads to spiraling thoughts, and I've learned that spiraling thoughts make the thing in the mirror restless. The strangest part is that I'm not entirely alone anymore, and not being alone is better than I would have expected. There's a presence in the apartment that isn't quite me and isn't quite foreign. It's been here long enough that its rhythms have synchronized with mine. We share the same bed, the same shower, the same breakfast eaten while staring out at the gray window light. I can feel it in the space next to me, most of the time the way you can feel another person in a dark room even when you can't see them. The only real difficulty comes in the evenings. When I'm getting ready for bed and I catch myself about to look in the mirror out of I keep finding my reflection blinking before I do, extended middle section the apartment had always been quiet. But that October felt different. Not louder, quieter. There's a distinction most people don't notice. The way silence can intensify until it becomes its own presence. It was the kind of quiet where you become hyper-aware of small sounds. The refrigerator's low hum, the ambient buzz of the building's electrical system, the occasional car passing on the street below. These sounds, usually invisible, now seemed to press against my ears. I'd started spending more time looking at the mirrors, though I wouldn't have admitted that to anyone. The bathroom mirror was the worst, or perhaps the most honest. It was the largest mirror in the apartment, a simple rectangular glass above the sink, framed in brushed chrome that had begun collecting dust along its edges. The dust caught light in the mornings, creating thin shadows across the reflection. I'd noticed myself standing there in the pre-dawn grayness, before showering, before coffee. And in those first moments of clarity, I'd become acutely aware of every detail in that reflected space. The slight discoloration on the ceiling from old water damage, the way the light from the hallway fell at a precise angle, the texture of the tile floor that looked gray but was actually a very pale blue. These details mattered now. They mattered in a way I couldn't articulate. The mirror in the hallway was smaller, positioned at eye level about 6 feet from my bedroom door. It was beveled, purchased years ago from an estate sale, and its frame was ornate wood with a finish that had darkened over time. When I walked past it at night, the reflection seemed to lag. There was a delay between my movement and its response. Not a delay, exactly, an uncertainty. The image in that mirror never quite felt synchronized with my own awareness of my body's position. It was like watching a video call where the audio is slightly out of sync with the lips moving. Disorienting, the beveled edges caught and fractured the light strangely, so sometimes I couldn't tell where the boundary was between the reflection and the reality of the hallway behind me. I'd stand in the kitchen, which had no mirrors except for the dark window above the sink, and at night that window became a mirror of sorts, a dark reflective surface that showed my silhouette against the interior lights. I'd be making tea, the kettle beginning its slow warm-up, and I'd catch sight of myself in that dark glass, the outline of my head, my shoulders. But in that reflected silhouette, movements didn't seem to match exactly. My hand would reach for the mug, and in the window's dark reflection, the hand movement appeared just slightly different in trajectory. The dread, when it came, was not a sudden spike. It built gradually, like sediment settling. It was there in the back of my awareness during ordinary moments, brushing teeth, eating lunch, sitting on the couch in the afternoon light. A kind of low-frequency worry that didn't attach itself to specific thoughts, but instead colored everything with a subtle wrongness. I'd find myself pausing before mirrors, hesitating before looking at my own face. That hesitation came from a place I couldn't identify. It was neither fear nor curiosity. It was something between them, something that didn't have a proper name. The living room had large windows facing the street, and on certain days when the sun was at particular angles, the glass created reflections of the interior. I'd sit reading, and I'd become aware of my reflection superimposed over the view outside, the street lights, the buildings across the way, trees with branches that moved with the wind. My reflection would be there, half transparent, sitting with a book, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I began to watch that reflection as carefully as I watched the book in front of me. At first, I told myself I was simply noticing the reflections more. Mirrors are everywhere after all. Most people live with them without thinking much about them. But I was thinking about them. Constantly, I was thinking about how a reflection is always a perfect duplicate, how it moves in absolute synchronicity with the body it reflects, how there is no possible way for a reflection to be out of sync with reality because a reflection is reality, just reversed. Light travels from a surface and enters your eye, and the image forms, and there is no gap, no delay possible. And yet, the sensation of something being fractionally wrong with my reflection had begun to nest in my mind like a persistent itch. When I wasn't looking at mirrors, I thought about them. When I was looking at them, I couldn't focus on anything else. The geometry of my own face became strange to me in these moments. The asymmetry that everyone has. How one eye sits slightly higher than the other. How my smile never quite reached both sides of my mouth equally. These ordinary human imperfections began to feel like clues. Clues to what, I couldn't say. I started keeping lights on in every room, even during the day. The bathroom in particular, I'd flip the switch and wait for the fluorescent panels to flicker and stabilize, casting their even, artificial glow over every surface. In that harsh light, there were no shadows to hide in, nowhere for uncertainty to breed. The mirror looked most reliable in that clinical brightness, most honest, but also most wrong, because in the fluorescent light I could see everything with perfect clarity, including the tiny discrepancies I'd begun to catalog. My reflection's eyes seemed to blink at their own rhythm, independent from my will. I could feel the moment before I blinked, that sensation of eyelids beginning to descend, and I could watch in the mirror, and the mirror would show my eyes closing at almost the same time, but not quite. A fraction of a second before, anticipating, arriving at that moment before I had. The apartment's air felt different, too. Thicker somehow despite the windows and the ventilation. There was a quality to it like before a storm, that particular density that changes how sound travels. I'd sit in the still air and listen to the building around me, the murmur of voices through walls, the plumbing systems moving water through pipes, the electrical current in the walls creating their low hum. All of these sounds seemed to come from very far away, and also from inside the walls directly beside my head. The space didn't feel neutral anymore. It felt reactive. Aware, the mirror by the bedroom door I began to avoid. Not consciously at first, I'd simply find myself taking different routes through the apartment, walking the long way around, taking paths that kept me from seeing my reflection there. But avoidance creates its own kind of awareness. The more I avoided looking, the more aware I became of the mirror's presence, of what might be visible there if I allowed myself to look. In the periphery of my vision, late at night when I was half asleep, I'd become conscious of that mirror's location. It pulled at my attention like a physical weight. The silence of the apartment deepened. I realized I was breathing very carefully, in measured ways, as if making noise might disturb something I couldn't see, as if the silence itself was a presence that could be startled. My heartbeat seemed audible in that quiet, a rhythm I'd usually never notice, now in constant companion, lub-dub, lub-dub, a metronome of my own existence that I couldn't stop perceiving. In the evenings, I'd sit in the living room with no lights on, watching the reflections in the darkened window, watching my silhouette move when I moved, watching it move at moments when I wasn't sure I was moving at all, watching it blink, always blinking just before I did, a half-second jump ahead, as if my reflection was anticipating something I hadn't yet chosen to do, as if the image in the glass wasn't a reflection at all, but something receiving information before I did, something that knew what I was about to do before I had decided to do it. And I'd sit there in the dark, very still, barely breathing, trying to be quicker than my own reflection, trying to catch it in the act of that impossible synchronization, trying to prove to myself that the world still followed its ordinary rules. Habit, there's a moment of vertigo where I remember, viscerally remember, what it was like to find my reflection doing something I hadn't authorized. But that feeling passes quickly. The thing on the other side of the glass is familiar now. It's almost comfortable, the way sharing an apartment with someone becomes comfortable, the way you stop noticing their presence. I think I know what happened to me. I think something found a way in through whatever small crack exists between intention and execution, that microsecond where the signal travels from mind to body. I think it wasn't an invasion so much as a slow merging, two states of being pressing against each other until the boundary became thin enough to see through. And I think I'm still me. Some essential part of me is still here, authoring these thoughts, living this life, but I'm not the only one anymore. What I've learned to accept in these quiet days in the apartment is that maybe that was always true. Maybe the lag between intention and execution isn't something new. Maybe everyone experiences that small death and resurrection at the boundary between thought and action, and most people are just less aware of it. Most people don't spend days with their attention so fractured that they notice the gap. Most people don't have to. But I've stopped regretting the noticing. I've stopped fighting the lag. Some nights I'll be lying in bed and I'll realize that I'm not certain which of us initiated the breath, and the feeling is almost like peace. The apartment feels full in a way it never did when I was alone. The silence has a quality to it now, not empty, but occupied. Present this morning, and I'm confident it was morning, though the light outside gives nothing away. I was brushing my teeth and I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, and it smiled at me. Not the hollow, exhausted grin from before. A real smile, the kind that crinkles the eyes. The kind I might make if I were still entirely myself. If my reflection and I hadn't long ago stopped being separate things. I smiled back, and this time the movement was synchronized perfectly, not a fraction of a second's lag. Just two versions of the same face smiling at each other across the glass, and for that moment I couldn't tell if we were in sync because we'd finally become one, or because one of us had finally stopped counting. The glasses of water have been cleared from the counter now, but there's one glass that refills itself, that I find full each morning on the bedside table. I drink from it without thinking, and sometimes, just before I sleep, I wonder who's been pouring it. I wonder if it matters. The apartment is quiet tonight. Outside the window, the gray light is just beginning to darken. And in the mirror, something that wears my face is waiting to see what I'll do next. But we both already know. We've been learning each other's habits for long enough now. I'm not afraid anymore. I don't think I have been for days. Story 3. The apartment where my furniture casts shadows from yesterday. The lamp casts a shadow I don't recognize. I notice it around 8 o'clock, sitting in the dark leather chair that came with me from the last place, the one I swore I'd replace but haven't gotten around to yet. The apartment is quiet in that particular way older buildings are quiet, the kind where you can hear the plumbing settling in the walls and the distant hum of a neighbor's television 3 units over. My desk lamp is on, a simple brass thing with a cream linen shade, positioned to my left on the side table. I've had it for 7 years. I know how its light falls, but the shadow beneath the chair, the one cast against the hardwood floor, is pointing the wrong direction. It stretches toward the window instead of away from the lamp. Not dramatically wrong, just enough that I notice it while I'm reading, enough that the noticing pulls me out of the page. I look at the lamp. The bulb is still lit, unchanged. The shade sits at the same angle it's been sitting at since I plugged it in 2 weeks ago when I unboxed my things in this apartment. This new place I don't know yet, with its creaking floorboards and its radiator that ticks in the middle of the night. I've always been observant, the kind of person who notices when things are slightly off. A picture frame tilted half an inch, a book spine facing the wrong way, the taste of milk that's about to turn. My mother used to say I was wired that way, that I'd make a good detective or a bad companion, depending on the day. In my old job, it paid off. I caught errors in spreadsheets that made other people's eyes slide right past. I saw the small discrepancies that suggested larger problems. This is a small discrepancy. I set down my book and leaned forward. The apartment smells like the particular mustiness of a place that's been locked up for a few months before I arrived. That underlying note of dust and old air that comes with rent-controlled units in 1970s buildings. The landlord had painted the walls an intentional cream, the kind of color that photographs well but feels slightly institutional in person. I've bought a few prints to break it up. Nothing's hung yet. I'm still in that stage of inhabiting a space before committing to it. The chair sits about 4 feet from the lamp. The light should pool around it, with the shadow falling back and to the side, toward the wall behind me, toward the kitchen doorway. Instead, it points steadily toward the bay window, where I can see the street below reflected in the glass. I reach over and adjust the lampshade, just slightly, a quarter turn counterclockwise. The shadow beneath the chair shifts, I watch it move, but it still points the same direction. Wrong, maybe the bulb is loose. That happens. They create odd reflections if they're not seated properly. I reach over and unscrew it just enough to feel the resistance, then screw it back down. The light doesn't flicker. I watch the shadow again. It hasn't moved. I stand up. The apartment isn't large. It's the kind of one bedroom that was designed to be precisely enough space and nothing more. I can see into the kitchenette from where I'm standing now, a line of black countertop, the edge of the refrigerator, a window over the sink that looks out onto a brick wall. To my right, the narrow hallway leads to the bedroom and bathroom. I'm in the main living area, which is also the dining area, which is also where my books are stacked in a corner waiting for shelving I haven't bought yet. This is where I'll sit on the weekends, where I'll read, where I'm supposed to feel comfortable. I pick up the lamp. It's heavier than I remember. The base is weighted, which is good. It means when I move it, the whole thing doesn't wobble. I shift it slightly to the right. 6 inches. Enough that the angle of light changes perceptibly. The shadow beneath the chair still points toward the window. This is when I should feel something. A small spike of unease. A logical mind that says, that's not possible, and then moves on. Finds the practical explanation. And I do think that. I do register the impossibility. But there's something else underneath it, a quieter feeling, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just sits in your chest and waits. I move to the window and look out at the street. Below, a car is parked opposite the building. The street light above it casts an orange glow. A woman is walking with a dog, the leash slack, both of them moving without urgency toward the corner. The evening is clear and dark, the kind of October night that promises winter is coming. There's nothing unusual in the street view, no unusual light source, no angle I'm missing. I turn back to look at the lamp and the chair and the shadow that shouldn't be there. The lamp is still on. The shade is still cream-colored linen. The bulb is visible inside, a normal incandescent, the kind I've bought 100 times, nothing special about it. And beneath the chair, the shadow stretches toward the window with the same patient certainty as before. I return to the chair and sit down slowly, as if moving deliberately might somehow change what I'm seeing. It doesn't. I can see my own shadow now, the outline of my torso and head against the far side of the armrest, and it falls in the correct direction. Back toward the light source. The proper way shadows work. The way shadows have always worked in every room I've ever inhabited. But the shadow beneath the chair, the one cast by the chair itself, remains unmoved. I pick up my book, try to read. The words don't stick. I've read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing it. My eyes keep sliding away from the page to the floor, to that shadow, to the way it seems to hold its shape with absolute precision. Like it's not being cast by light at all, like it's being held in place by something else, something very deliberate. The apartment is quiet except for the distant sound of the neighbor's television bleeding through the wall. A laugh track, a commercial. The ordinary noise of ordinary people living in ordinary buildings, in a city full of millions of people who don't notice anything wrong with their shadows at all. I look at the lamp again. It's been on for approximately 2 hours. The bulb hasn't changed. The electricity is flowing through it normally, and yet, I reach over and turn the lamp off. The room goes gray. The window darkens. The street light from outside provides the only illumination now, enough to see shapes, not enough to see details. And in that grayness, for just a moment, I can see the shadow beneath the chair more clearly than ever. It's faint, but it's there, distinct from the darkness. A darker shadow within shadow, pointing steadily toward the window, cast from no light I can identify, falling from no source that exists in this room. Then my eyes adjust, and the ambient light from outside makes everything more uncertain. I can't tell if the shadow is still there or if I've only imagined it now. The power of suggestion, the mind creating patterns. I turn the lamp back on. It returns immediately. Clear, precise, wrong. I sit in the chair and watch it for the next hour. I watch it while the neighbor's television plays. I watch it while the street outside grows quieter. I watch it while the city's evening settles into something darker and more complete. And it never moves. It never changes. It simply remains there, the shadow of my chair, cast from a light source that doesn't exist in any direction I can measure. By the time I close my book and turn off the lamp for the night, I've stopped expecting it to make sense. I've already started accepting that it won't. The next morning, I wake to the sound of the kettle. Not boiling. Not whistling. The sound of water beginning to heat. That low, almost inaudible hum that precedes the rolling bubble, the moment before the heating element reaches full intensity. It's a sound that shouldn't exist at this hour, in this apartment, because I didn't fill the kettle. I didn't turn it on. I lie in bed for several seconds, listening. The hum continues. Steady, deliberate, the kind of sound you don't question if you've made it yourself, but absolutely notice when you haven't. The apartment is still dark. 6:17 in the morning, the gray light of early winter pressing against the windows. I push the blanket aside and move down the hallway toward the kitchen, my feet cold against the hardwood floor. The kettle sits on the stove, exactly where it always lives. Except it's full. Steam is beginning to rise from the spout, visible in the cool kitchen air. The dial on the burner reads high heat. I didn't do this. I stand there for almost a minute, staring at it. My mind runs through the sequence. Did I actually not do it? Did I get up in the night, half asleep, and forget? Did I stand at this stove in the darkness and fill this kettle and turn this dial without any memory of it happening? It's possible. It's happened before to others. The human mind is capable of elaborate actions in sleep. I've read about this. People cooking meals they don't remember. People driving to places they've never been conscious to reach. The body goes through motions while the awareness is somewhere else entirely. I turn off the burner. The hum slows. The steam diminishes. But I don't drink the tea. That evening I noticed the books on my shelf have been reorganized. Not dramatically, not obviously enough that anyone looking at the shelf would immediately recognize it as disturbed. But I have a system. I've had this system for 3 years. The books are organized not by any traditional method, not by author, not by genre, not by color, but by the order in which I acquired them. A personal chronology of reading, a timeline I can trace backward through my own preferences. The oldest book on the left, the newest on the right. This matters to me in a way I can't fully explain to anyone who hasn't done it, so I haven't tried. 3 books have been moved. They're in the correct section of the shelf. They haven't been relocated to another room. They've simply been rotated out of sequence, placed back in the order I acquired them, but shifted slightly, as if someone was looking for something specific. The spine of the middle one faces the wrong direction. I sit on my bed and stare at the shelf. My laptop is closed on the nightstand. The apartment is empty except for me. The windows are locked. The door has been locked since I came home. I have keys to both. No one has been here. And yet, I get up and walk over to the shelf. I reach out and touch the displaced books, feeling the slight dust on the tops of their spines, the way the pages have shifted and settled. They're warm from the radiator nearby. My hands are cold. I put the 3 books back in order. Tomorrow, I tell myself, I'll pay attention. Tomorrow, I'll be more careful. I'll note the exact positions of things. I'll create markers. I'll prove that nothing is moving, that my mind is simply becoming unreliable in the way that minds do sometimes, creating patterns from chaos, finding meaning in random arrangements of objects. But that night, sleep feels dangerous. The darkness of the bedroom feels less like absence and more like presence, something occupying space, waiting for me to close my eyes so it can move the books again, feel the kettle, adjust the way my furniture throws its shadows. I sleep with the lamp on. The coffee mug is in the wrong cabinet. This is a smaller thing, easier to dismiss. I own 14 mugs. They're not assigned to specific locations. They live in the cupboard above the sink, arranged in no particular order, and I grab whichever one is within reach each morning, except this one, the gray ceramic with the thin crack along the bottom that I've been meaning to throw away. This one I know for certain lives in the back left corner of the cupboard. I placed it there myself, deliberately, so I'd see it less often, so I'd use the other mugs instead. It's been there for 4 months. This morning, it's in the front right. Perfectly visible. Easy to reach. I stand in front of the open cupboard door, my hand still raised to where I was reaching for a different mug, and I feel something shift inside my chest. A sensation like recognition. The moment you realize you've been being watched without knowing it. I take the gray mug down. I turn it over in my hands. It feels the same. Identical to the last time I held it. The crack is still there, thin and delicate along the bottom, the glaze slightly discolored in a line where it will eventually break through completely. Nothing about the mug has changed. I put it back. Same spot. Front right. I choose a different mug and make my coffee. But all day at work, I find myself thinking about it. The mug in the wrong place. The books shifted in their sequence. The kettle filled with water I didn't pour. The shadow beneath the chair cast from a source that doesn't exist. Small things. Explainable things. Each one, in isolation, something I could attribute to forgetfulness or confusion. But together, accumulated, stacked, building into a pattern, they begin to feel like something more intentional, something methodical, something learning. I buy a notebook, not for any productive reason, just to document, to write down the small misplacements before I forget them, before my mind can rewrite the reality of them. I buy the kind of notebook with the lined pages, the kind that comes with a ribbon bookmark, the kind that feels serious and permanent in a way that carrying around loose scraps of paper doesn't. On the first page, I write the date. Then I write kettle. Books, mug need to establish baseline, need to track. I feel ridiculous, like someone who's beginning to lose their grip on normalcy, documenting the symptoms of their own unraveling. But the alternative is to pretend it's not happening, to ignore the accumulation, to let it continue without acknowledgement. That evening, I walk through the apartment methodically. I note the exact position of every object I interact with, the location of my keys on the kitchen counter, left side of the counter, approximately 6 inches from the edge, the orientation of the bathroom mat in front of the sink, top edge pointing toward the door, the placement of my journal on the nightstand, spine facing the window, the notebook open to the first page, the pen resting in the spine. Small things, markers, points of reference. I lock myself in. I turn on every light. And then I sit in the dark, because I turn off the lights again, because I need to understand what I'm looking at, because the strange shadow beneath the chair seems more visible in darkness, more willing to reveal itself. It's there. Of course it's there. The dark shape pointing toward the window cast from no discernible source. I've stopped trying to explain it. The physics of it are too elaborate. The light sources in this room are simple and logical. The shadow shouldn't exist, and yet it does with such precision that I've become almost fond of it. At least the shadow is consistent. At least the shadow hasn't moved. I sit very still, listening to the apartment around me. The radiator ticks as it cools. The pipes in the walls settle with small pops and creaks. Outside, the city hums with the distant sound of traffic, of people living their ordinary lives, of the world continuing to move forward while I sit in my apartment watching shadows, waiting for something to be displaced again. And in that stillness, I become aware of a presence in the room that isn't sound and isn't sight. It's the sense that something has been here, something other than me, not a person, not an animal, just a consciousness, a deliberate attention, moving through my space while I was gone, looking at my things, considering them, deciding which ones to move, which ones to leave exactly as they were, The apartment is very quiet. And then, slowly, I become aware that I'm no longer alone in the room. Not because of any sound, not because of any change in the light or the air, but because I can feel it, the certainty of presence, the absolute knowledge that something else is here, occupying the darkness with me, waiting to see what I'll do next. I don't turn on the lights. I simply sit in the chair with the impossible shadow, and I wait. And in the waiting, I become aware that I'm no longer certain which of us is the visitor and which of us lives here. I'm no longer certain I ever was. The journal becomes obsessive after that night. I fill pages with observations that grow increasingly fragmented as the days collapse into each other. I stop going to work. I call in sick on a Tuesday, then again on Thursday, then I don't call at all. The absences feel less like decisions and more like things that simply happen, the way water runs downhill. I track everything now, not just position but time, the exact moment I place an object, the exact moment I find it displaced. I've created a system of marks, small pencil dots on the baseboards, notches in the corners where walls meet, reference points. A grid of certainty in a space that has become fundamentally unreliable. The chair with the impossible shadow is my center. I spend most of my time there, notebook balanced on my lap, watching the room shift around me in ways that have nothing to do with light or angle or the movement of the sun across the window. My coffee mug moves. I place it on the kitchen counter at 8:47 a.m. I mark the position in the notebook with a photograph on my phone. I've started doing this, taking pictures. Time-stamped evidence that I'm not imagining. At 11:23 a.m., it's 3 feet to the left. Same counter, same kitchen, but the mug has traveled, and I didn't move it. The mug is ceramic, white, with a small chip on the rim. I've had it for 7 years. It's ordinary in every way except that it's in the wrong place, and I know, with the kind of certainty that bypasses logic entirely, that something moved it. I bring the mug back. I place it exactly where it was. I sit in the living room with the lights off and I wait. At 2:15 p.m., it moves again. This time I'm watching. Not watching the mug directly, I learned quickly that direct observation changes things, that the moment I look too hard at an object, it becomes static, refuses to participate in whatever this is. Instead, I watch the edge of the kitchen from my position in the chair. I watch the periphery, the space where the kitchen exists in my peripheral vision. And in that not quite looking, I see movement. Not the mug moving, something moving the mug. A shape, barely defined, like watching someone move through a room where all the lights are off. Not quite there. Not quite not there. When I turn to look directly, there's nothing. Just the mug, 3 feet to the left again, sitting on the counter as though it's been there all morning. I don't bring it back this time. Instead, I sit in the chair, and I begin to understand something that I've been avoiding. The thing in my apartment isn't hostile. It's not trying to frighten me. It's trying to communicate. It's trying to tell me something through the movement of objects, through the displacement of small, ordinary things, through the reorganization of my space into a language I should be able to read but can't quite parse. It's patient. That's what terrifies me most. The absolute patience of it. The way it moves things just slowly enough that I almost convince myself I'm wrong. The way it waits for me to adjust, to accept, to stop questioning, and then it does something else. Something slightly more elaborate, something harder to deny. My books are arranged alphabetically. I've kept them that way for 3 years. It's a specific form of control, organizing the world into a system where everything has a place and everything stays in that place. On Friday morning, they're organized by color. Every single one, from light to dark, a gradient that moves across the shelf like a sunset or a bruise. I didn't do this. My hands were never on these books. My mind was not engaged in this task. And yet here it is, meticulous, careful, somehow thoughtful. Like someone explaining something to me in a language I can almost understand. I leave the books as they are. That night, I sleep on the chair. Not comfortably. The chair was never designed for sleeping. My neck angle's wrong, my body folds in on itself, but I can't bring myself to sleep in the bedroom. The bedroom is farther from the living room. The bedroom has only one exit. The bedroom doesn't have the chair with the impossible shadow. I sleep in intervals, waking at random points to check the apartment. The lights stay on now, all of them, every bulb burning. The apartment glows like a small island in the darkness outside, visible from the street below, I imagine. A beacon. Nothing moves while I'm watching, but everything has moved by the time I stop paying attention. The apartment is reconfiguring itself. That's the only way I can describe it. Not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious to someone visiting, but subtly, incrementally, the space is being organized according to a logic that isn't mine. The furniture angles differently, the wall hangings shift by degrees. My books arrange themselves by color, then by size, then by some other metric I can't identify. The curtains, which I always keep half drawn, are now completely closed. Then open again. Then half drawn but mirrored, closed on the window I thought opened them on, open on the other side. I stop leaving the apartment. I tell myself it's because I don't want to come home to more displacement, more evidence of occupation, more proof that my space is being edited without my consent. But the truth is more complicated. The truth is that I'm beginning to understand that the apartment itself has become a kind of narrative, and I'm both the author and the character being written. I'm both the observer and the observed. I'm both the one moving things and the one discovering they've been moved. This is the thought that arrives on the 6th day, or maybe the 7th. I've stopped tracking time with any precision. The days have become a blur of observation and documentation, of watching and waiting. The thought arrives quietly, like the presence in the room, like something that's always been here. What if I'm the one doing this? What if some part of me, some part that operates when I'm not paying attention, when I'm asleep or focused elsewhere, has been systematically rearranging my apartment? What if the displacement, the movement, the subtle shifting of the world around me is not an intrusion, but an expression of something inside myself that I can't access when I'm conscious? What if I'm haunting my own apartment? I sit with this thought for a long time. The chair holds me. The impossible shadow stretches beneath it, pointing toward the window as it always does. The apartment hums with the presence of something that might be me, or might be other, and the distinction has become so thin and fragile that I'm no longer sure which category I fall into. I open my journal. I look at the pages of documentation, the careful notes, the time stamps and photographs, the evidence of something happening, the proof of displacement. And slowly, very slowly, I begin to realize that I can't remember writing some of these entries. There are pages in my handwriting that I have no memory of composing, observations that don't reflect anything I remember thinking, records of events I have no recollection of documenting. The handwriting is mine. The ink is the same, but the thoughts, the observations, the careful cataloging of displacement, these feel like they come from someone else, someone who was looking at my apartment with the same attention I'm looking at it now, but who was inhabiting my hands, using my pen, writing in my journal while I was somewhere else, nowhere, fractured into a version of myself that pays attention to different things. I close the journal. I don't open it again. Instead, I sit in the chair and I watch the mug on the kitchen counter, still 3 feet to the left of where I originally placed it, and I wait. Because I'm beginning to understand that the question isn't whether the apartment is haunted. The question is whether the person sitting in the chair, watching the mug, documenting the displacement, is the same person who has been moving things all along. The question is, which version of me is real? And as that question settles into the room, as it becomes one more presence among many in the darkness, I hear the soft sound of something moving, not in the kitchen, somewhere deeper in the apartment. The bedroom, perhaps, or the hallway, or a space that exists in the walls, in the spaces between rooms, in the geography of the apartment that doesn't quite match what I remember. Something that sounds like footsteps, but softer. Something that sounds like breath, but not quite human. Something that has been here all along, waiting for me to stop asking whether it came from outside and start asking whether it came from in. I don't turn to look. I already know what I'll find. The sunlight arrives on a Thursday morning without announcement, and for the first time in weeks, I notice it. Golden light streaming across the hardwood floor, illuminating dust particles that have been invisible in the darkness. I've spent so much time watching the apartment at night, watching it in the liminal hours before dawn, that I'd almost forgotten what it looked like in ordinary daylight. Almost because even in sunlight, something is different. The apartment feels occupied in a way that has nothing to do with furniture or displacement. It feels inhabited by a presence that has settled into the walls, that has made a home in the spaces between my observations and my forgetting. I can feel it the way you feel someone in a room even when you're not looking at them. That settled pressure of attention, that knowledge that you're being perceived. I've stopped looking at the mug on the kitchen counter. It moved again 2 days ago, this time 3 feet further left, now so close to the edge of the counter that I'm surprised it hasn't fallen. The edge of it hangs suspended over nothing. It shouldn't be stable. It should tip at any moment. But it remains there, perfectly balanced, waiting. I don't move it back. I don't touch it at all. I've also stopped documenting. The journal sits closed on the coffee table, and I've made a conscious decision not to open it, not to read the entries I don't remember writing. There's a version of me that knows what's in those pages, what observations have been made, what careful documentation has been compiled. And that version of me is not the one sitting here in daylight, watching the mug, breathing the recycled air of an apartment that no longer quite feels like mine. Doctor, Reeves called this morning. I answered the phone, and his voice came through with the careful neutrality of someone who has been trained not to alarm. He wanted to check in. He wanted to know how I was managing. He asked if I was still taking the medication, and I said yes, because it seemed like the kind of thing he needed to hear. He asked if the symptoms had improved, and I understood that he was referring to some specific list of symptoms, some clinical vocabulary that had been applied to my experience and filed away in a folder somewhere with my name on it. I told him I was sleeping better. This is partially true. I sleep. But I'm no longer certain that the sleep and the waking are as distinct as they once were. There are hours that pass without my perceiving them. There are gaps in the day where I have no recollection of what I was doing, and yet nothing feels particularly wrong. The apartment is still standing. I've eaten. My clothes have changed. Someone has paid attention to the basic mechanics of living. It's possible that someone was me. After I hung up with Dr. Reeves, I walked through the apartment in daylight, really looking at it for the first time in days. The furniture is mostly where it should be. The kitchen is tidy. The bedroom is untouched. The hallway stretches from the entrance to the back bedroom in exactly the configuration I remember. And I've stopped questioning whether it used to be longer. Maybe it was always this length. Maybe my memory of a longer hallway was the distortion, not the hallway itself. There's a framed photograph on the wall near the bedroom, a picture of a landscape I don't immediately recognize. Hills, a small house in the distance, afternoon light. I have no memory of hanging this photograph, and yet my eye moves past it without surprise. It belongs to the apartment. It has always been there. Or it arrived so gradually, slipping into the wall in such small increments, that my perception accepted it as permanent before my conscious mind registered its arrival. I don't remove it. The sunlight makes everything seem reasonable. It makes the apartment seem like the kind of place where normal things happen, where people live and work and eat and sleep and think their own thoughts in the privacy of their own minds. In daylight, the idea of fractured consciousness, of a version of myself operating without my knowledge, feels almost quaint, almost like something I imagined. But as afternoon shifts toward evening, and the light begins to move across the floor in that slow, deliberate way it has. I notice that the shadows are returning, not to wrong angles or impossible directions, but shadows nonetheless. The lamp in the corner casts a shadow that seems to have volume to it, that seems to exist in 3 dimensions rather than 2. The edge of the couch throws a shadow that extends further than simple geometry should allow. I've learned not to measure them anymore. Instead, I sit in the chair, the same chair where I sat during the weeks of observation, and I watch the evening settle into the apartment. The mug on the kitchen counter catches the last rays of sunlight. It glows with a golden light that makes it look almost beautiful, almost like it wants to be there, almost like it placed itself exactly where it wants to remain. At some point as darkness falls, I become aware of a sound, not footsteps, something quieter, something like the expanded middle section of the apartment had always been quiet. But quiet is a relative thing. There's the quiet of peace, the kind you sink into on a Sunday afternoon with coffee and open windows. This was not that. This was the quiet of held breath, the kind that builds pressure behind your sternum until you wonder if you're breathing at all. I began testing the apartment like one might test thin ice, moving carefully through rooms I'd inhabited for 3 years, as if the space might suddenly reveal itself as foreign. The carpet in the living room, a woven gray that I'd chosen specifically because it wouldn't show dirt, felt different under my feet. I noticed it one morning while still half asleep. The texture almost bristled, resistant, as though it had become denser overnight. I pressed my palm flat against it. The fibers felt faintly warm, and when I lifted my hand, I could see the faint impression of my fingers lingering for longer than seemed natural, before slowly fading back to uniformity. The light in the apartment had changed, too. I'm certain of this, even though I know how that sounds. It's not that it was darker or brighter, it was something more fundamental. The quality had become slightly opalescent, like everything was being viewed through a thin membrane of something translucent, not glass, nothing so crisp. More like the space between waking and sleeping had somehow entered the room itself, that moment where your eyes are open but the world hasn't quite achieved solidity yet. This particular quality of light seemed to accumulate throughout the day. In the morning, it was barely perceptible. By evening, it was almost suffocating. I moved through the apartment cataloging things that wouldn't stay cataloged. The coffee table, a simple piece of blonde wood with a single shelf below, sat at what I thought was a 90-degree angle to the sofa. One morning I found myself noticing that the angle had shifted somehow. Not dramatically, but enough that my eyes kept catching on it, that there was a visual discord that made me tense. I nudged it back. By the next day, it had drifted again. I stopped adjusting it. Instead, I began to notice how the shadows it cast changed, not with the movement of sun throughout the day, but independently, as if the table were rotating through space I couldn't see. The bedroom was where the strangeness had first manifested most clearly, but I spent less time there now. I'd sleep on the couch instead, telling myself it was practical, I was reading late, I didn't want to disturb the fresh sheets, the morning light came differently there. All true. All convenient lies layered over the real reason I didn't want to watch the shadows in there anymore. But avoiding a room doesn't make it stop existing. The bedroom shadows had a persistence to them that violated every rule of how light and shadow should behave. If I went in during the afternoon, when sunlight streamed clearly through the window, there were still deep pools of darkness in the corners that matched no obstruction I could identify. I'd stand in those corners. There was nothing there. No lamp, no furniture, no architectural feature that would justify such total darkness. Yet the shadow would envelope me, and the light from the window would seem to bend away from it, would refuse entry. At night, it was worse. The bedroom darkness was complete, of course, as darkness should be. But when I turned on the small lamp beside the bed, the light it produced seemed thin, inadequate, as if the darkness was pressing back against it. I'd get into bed hastily, always, and lie there listening to my own heartbeat, feeling the quality of the darkness around me like a presence with texture, cold, watchful. And that's when I'd notice the shadows cast by my furniture, rendered in perfect definition despite the single weak light source. The shadows were always more detailed than the objects that created them. This became an obsession. I would go back to the bedroom during the day, in bright sunlight, and study the nightstand. Simple wood, unadorned, small drawers with brass pulls. When I looked at its shadow on the wall, cast by sunlight so direct that the shadow should have been basic, almost crude in its simplicity, I would see intricate details, elaborate trim work I'd never noticed on the actual piece, carved patterns that didn't exist on the nightstand itself, ornamental flourishes rendered in perfect shadow black along the edges. When I moved closer to examine the nightstand directly, these details vanished from the shadow. Step back, and they reappeared, impossibly elaborate. I ran my hands over the surface. Smooth, unmarked, simple, the shadow on the wall showed something ancient and complex, something that belonged in a different room entirely, in a different time. The couch was similar, a modern piece mid-century in style with clean lines and a modest profile. I'd bought it because I liked how uncluttered it looked, how it didn't dominate a room. But its shadow was substantial in a way the couch wasn't. The shadow had more depth, suggested an architecture of fabric and wood that the actual couch didn't possess. The shadow's arms looked more ornate. The cushions appeared overstuffed in shadow form, luxurious, almost decadent. In reality, the couch was spare. Utilitarian, I began taking photographs. My phone's camera captured the couch and the wall behind it faithfully. In the images, the couch looked exactly as it was in person. Unremarkable, but to my eyes, standing in the room, the shadow told a different story. The camera was missing what my eyes were perceiving. Or perhaps my eyes were perceiving something the camera was too literal, too mechanical, to record. I studied my own shadow with dread building in my chest. Standing with the afternoon light coming through the living room window, I watched my shadow on the opposite wall. It was me, obviously, same proportions, same silhouette. But standing there watching it, I became acutely aware of my own outline, the boundary between me and air. The shadow was perfectly defined, almost too defined. A dark version of myself so crisp it seemed three-dimensional. And sometimes I'm not certain, so I stopped looking to verify. Sometimes the shadow moved fractionally before I did. The apartment was consuming my attention in a way that was difficult to articulate to myself, much less to anyone else. The rational part of my mind cataloged explanations. Dust settling differently. Changes in the angle of light as the season shifted. Furniture steadily settling or shifting. My own perception being unreliable, the apartment looked the same because it was the same, and my mind was simply layering new interpretations onto familiar spaces. But the rational explanations began to feel like the unreliable thing. I started staying in the apartment less, longer hours at work, coffee with friends I hadn't seen in months, walks around the neighborhood that lasted hours. Anything to not be in the rooms where the shadows were becoming more detailed, more elaborate, more clearly not the shadows of the furniture in front of me, but shadows of something else, something that existed in another layer of space, overlapping with mine, almost but not quite invisible except for these dark impressions it left behind. When I did have to return to the apartment, I'd prepare myself. I'd stand in the hallway outside my door, key in hand, and take a long breath. The familiar smell of the space would reach me, a combination of the particular dust of the building's age, the ghost of cooking from days past, something faintly vegetal from the plant I'd kept in the kitchen window. The plant was dead now. I hadn't watered it. I'd decided it was easier to let it die than to watch it slowly deteriorate. The apartment itself was slowly deteriorating in a way I couldn't stop, so I decided to stop fighting it. Inside, the air was still. It barely moved around me when I walked. I became conscious of displacing it, of my movement creating tiny currents that didn't seem to dissipate naturally. They seemed to linger, as if the air itself was heavier, more viscous. Walking to the kitchen felt like moving through something only slightly less dense than water. The kitchen was the least affected. This surprised me. I'd expected it to be worse somehow, but the kitchen remained stubbornly mundane. The appliances cast normal shadows. The cabinet sat at perfect right angles. No elaborate shadow details revealed something other than what existed. It was the most normal space in the apartment, and for that reason I began spending time there, standing at the counter, not doing anything in particular, just existing in the absence of the strange. It was a relief so profound it made my hands shake. But I couldn't stay there forever. At night, lying on the couch in the living room, because I still wasn't ready to confront the bedroom again, I would lie perfectly still and listen to the apartment. It made sounds, all apartments do. Pipes settling, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of neighbors moving around above or beside me. But these sounds seem to have changed too. They had a quality of being just slightly off time, as if I were hearing them a fraction of a second after they actually occurred. The neighbors' footsteps would sound in my ceiling, and by the time I heard them, they'd almost be past. It created a lag between stimulus and perception that made me feel untethered from the moment I was living in. I'd lie there listening to this delay, feeling my heart rate elevate, waiting for it to resolve. It never did. Around 3 in the morning, always around 3, the sounds would stop. The apartment would achieve a silence so complete it felt like a held breath, like the building was listening to me the way I was listening to it. That silence would last perhaps 30 seconds, though time had become unreliable too, and it might have been longer or shorter. Then the ambient sounds would resume, and I'd feel my shoulders drop as the tension released, my body certain that danger had passed, though nothing had actually happened. The shadows grew more elaborate during these nights. I'd wake to find that the table's shadow on the wall had taken on new details. The chair's shadow had become more ornate. They were becoming pictures of objects that no longer existed, if they'd ever existed at all. Memories rendered in darkness, or perhaps promises of what these pieces would become, given time. I found myself understanding something terrible without being able to articulate it. The apartment wasn't changing. I was. My perception of it was shifting incrementally, detail by detail, the familiar becoming uncanny, the mundane revealing hidden depths that might have always been there or might be created by my looking. The shadows were my apartment's true form, and I was slowly losing the ability to see anything except the truth of them. The thought brought no comfort. Sound of breathing, but so soft that I can't tell if it's coming from outside the apartment or from somewhere inside myself. The distinction has become so subtle that I don't bother trying to separate them anymore. The apartment breathes. I breathe. There's a presence that moves through these rooms, and whether that presence is something other or some fractured version of myself, I've learned that the question itself is less important than the acceptance of its existence. I don't turn on any lights. I simply sit in the darkness and feel the company of something that might be me, that shares my space in my apartment and my thoughts in ways that I can't fully articulate or understand. I think about Dr. Reeves, about the medication in the cabinet above my sink, about the clinical vocabulary that was meant to contain and categorize this experience. I think about the journal, still closed, still containing observations that I don't remember making, and I think about the gap between sleep and waking, that narrow space where one becomes the other. I think about how there might be hours there that belong to neither state, hours that exist in a dimension parallel to my conscious experience, hours where a different version of me moves through these rooms, observing and documenting and slowly rearranging the world into configurations that make sense to a part of myself that I can never quite meet. never quite understand. The mug on the kitchen counter remains in its precarious position, balanced on the edge of nothing, waiting, and I've come to understand that it's not waiting for me to move it back. It's waiting for me to accept it exactly as it is. It's waiting for me to stop questioning the displacement and simply allow the apartment to be a place where things are not quite where they should be, where furniture casts shadows from impossible angles, where the hallway might be longer or shorter than memory suggests, where some nights a version of myself writes in a journal that I can't remember composing. The present settles more fully into the darkness. It's comfortable here. It's made a home in the spaces between my thoughts. And as I sit in the chair, as the evening deepens into night, as the apartment holds its breath around me, I realize that I'm no longer frightened of this presence. I'm only afraid of what I might discover if I ever truly separate myself from it. The mug remains on the counter. The hallway stretches into darkness. And somewhere in the apartment, in a room that doesn't quite match my memory of it, something continues its slow, careful work. Something that wears my face when I'm not looking, that writes in my handwriting when I'm asleep, that moves through these rooms with the quiet certainty of something that has always belonged here. And I remain in the chair, watching the shadows, listening to the breathing, waiting for the moment when I can no longer tell which side of the darkness I'm on. That moment feels very close.